with Andrea Kollnitz, who is an assistant professor of art history at Östra University, and we together with Louise Wallenberg, who is a professor of fashion studies, are putting together an anthology called Fashion Studies and Ethics, Past and Present, which is coming out later this year. So I'd like to hear a bit about the background. Can you describe how you started?
Yeah, we had the idea for such a topic in 2017. Me and Louise were both very active in aesthetic matters of fashion because our backgrounds are in film or cinema studies and art history. So we've always been together very interested in visual and aesthetic aspects of fashion, but dealing with the multidisciplinary importance of fashion when becoming fashion scholars, we realize there is a very strong urgency in looking at fashion from many perspectives, not least because of the enormous ethical complications that the fashion industry, the fashion system, fashion media and so on has produced during the past decennia. It made us just aware that there is big urgency in discussing this in a bigger forum, and we had a good network of international scholars from all kinds of areas in the world that we wanted to activate in a symposium on fashion aesthetics and ethics. So the symposium was the first start for this idea, inviting scholars who have been thinking and writing a lot of theoretical or also more empirically focused research on fashion ethical matters, and we collected these and invited these scholars to present their papers. Yes, sorry.
Well, I mean, I see in parts of the draft for introduction you're writing right now, and you stress now here the urgency in the present, because all these ethical challenges, it has not just to do with the pandemic, but with environmental issues, global warming, the material infrastructure of the fashion industry. So how are you approaching that? Those issues. I mean, there's a lot of critique against the fashion world today. And
yes.
How does your book approach those issues?
Well, one aspect is to try to both give historical and contemporary perspectives, showing that the problem of fashion is an old one. Moralizing criticism of fashion has been existing since the medieval ages. And different power institutions have criticized fashion for different things. So overconsumption of fashion, for example, was a big deal even during the medieval ages, when fashion started to be produced in a more massive production system, like a first industrial revolution during the 14th century. Later on, other ethical issues were added, like the constant discourse of the body as partly deformed by fashion or as mistreated by fashion, or also, of course, gender and class issues, aristocracy over-consuming fashion and emptying the treasure boxes of the nation and so on, or also nationalist and xenophobic notions of fashion coming from abroad and minimizing the national economy and so on, and also gender issues, of course, men dressing up too femininely, or women being victims of fashion, or commercially encaptured in fashion, in the fashion industry's constant pushing of changes. And this today, so the debate today is somehow historically based, and the philosophies around consumption, ethical treatment of nature are as historical, are as timeless in a way. So that's one of the approaches, taking in both historical and contemporary cases in a way. Some of the texts are more case study based and coming from different disciplines like art history or social studies or economy. Others are more theoretical and philosophical, for example, your own, Malcolm Barnard writing about choice as a both ethical and fashion-related mechanism.
Do you think now, I mean, these challenges now from all strands are directed against the fashion industry, which would you say are the most relevant responses from the industry itself? Is there, I mean, there's a lot of critique against the fashion industry, but are there any really relevant responses, if you would say so? Is this the case? Is fashion being transformed from the other side as well?
I think a lot is happening at the moment, not least due to the ongoing pandemic. The fashion industry has to rethink its production cycle. But even before this, even before people started to think over their consumption or reduce it in the way it is done, probably going on at the moment, the fashion designers, for example, retreated from the fashion cycle, production cycle, from this very, very quick and devastating, in a way, exploitative cycle of production. For example, Ralph Simmons leaving Dior because of its enormous speed and getting a burnout and so on, and not being able as a designer to deal with this enormous speed and pressure. But also the criticism against fashion factories in Bangladesh and so on, leading to a lot of health problems, extremely low wages and so on. All of this has been on the question for such a long time that fashion brands today, they just cannot go on as they have. On the other hand, they are accused of greenwashing, and for example, the contribution by Herman Ståhl in our book, it's questioning the idea of circular economy, showing that this is more of a play for the galleries in a way. So there is a lot of interesting questioning also of mechanisms of greenwashing. So I think the fashion industry is trying to find alternative ways of production and ethical thinking in sustainability. A brand like Philippa K, for example, is trying to produce sustainable fashion in terms of creating fashion that is timeless, for example, that can be worn for 20 years without deteriorating and so on. So
would that succeed?
Sorry?
Fashion that is timeless? Is there something?
I think some brands are succeeding with such a, but of course.
It seems like a contradiction somehow. Fashion
yes,
is timeless.
Exactly, but it's always been there has always been an anti-fashion tendency coming from the arts and.
So what what we're talking about are maybe more oriented towards the material side of fashion, production, circulation, consumption. But I assume that this will also have effects on, let's call it, the aesthetic side, put it a bit simply. I know your own work has dealt a lot with the use of photography or representation. So would those material changes also transform the aesthetics of fashion, or the way we represent it, the way we display it and show it?
Yeah, there is, for example, a development towards a body positivist attitude, or much more diversity in representing bodies of different kinds. A recent example is Calvin Klein shifting to a totally different type of modeling in using the transgender plus size model Jerry Jones as a bathing suit model, compared to the earlier representations of Justin Bieber with a naked chest and thin girls and so on. So there is a big debate around body ideals and also gender norms, which the fashion media always have been both confirming and creating, but also breaking against and throwing.
So I was thinking also you as an art historian. I mean, you said that it's always been criticism. I mean, from the art world against the fashion world. There are also obvious mergers between the art world and the fashion world.
Yes.
So in what sense do you think there could be? I mean, today, 2021 or 2021, what would be an interesting collaboration between art and fashion? What would it look like?
Yeah, well, there have been interesting collaborations, of course, not only in terms of huge famous artists contributing to fashion brands, like Yayoi Kusama working with Louis Vuitton and so on. These are more of might be seen in a more cynical light, or also the huge art museums built by fashion brands. These are, of course, economic win-win situations, but I think that art and fashion can really support each other in creating alternative ways of both creating fashion, wearing fashion, and meanings of fashion, cultural meanings of fashion. Looking back, I need to think a bit. There was this exhibition at Liljevalchs a few years ago on utopian bodies, for example, which brought out fashion designers from both the fin de siècle, 1900, to today, which actively tried to create utopian revolutionary garments or practices, or a new personality of wearer types and so on, in order to change the world, which was also like the idea of artists around 1900 and the late 19th century. Artists have to be creators of fashion in order to change the world according to ethical and aesthetically superior model. So this is something that is still living, I think, and it's still going on, but will show different outcomes. And of course, there are designers today who very actively work with political statements. Vivienne Westwood has been working with political statements for a long time, only looking at these very famous ones. Or even like designers like the late Alexander McQueen was very much aware of women's situation, creating fashion for empowered women in order to resist violence and violations of the body and so on. So there is a lot of thinking at fashion designers who actually want to change values and change norms. And I'm also thinking of the development at Beckmans, for example, the Swedish fashion college, design college, which is showing, looking at their final exhibitions each year for their freshly examined, the graduated students. They very much engage in political issues. Each fashion collection has a political message almost, which has been recently reported on by Susanna Strömquist in DN, for example. So it's become really important to make a political statement with your fashion collection.
You think that you and Louise, you're working together at the Department of Fashion Styles at Stockholm University, and I mean, fashion studies is a fairly recent discipline inside the university structure. Do you think that I mean, I guess it has existed in other countries for much longer time, but would you say that the establishment of a department of fashion studies somehow signals a different take on fashion in the academic world, or is that part of a more expanded sense of fashion that also would include ethical, political, and other issues? Is that something that your department is actively striving against?
I need to. Could you just repeat the main?
No, I'm saying that the compared to newness of fashion study at Stockholm University and in Sweden as well, and does that signal a different place of fashion in the academic world? Does it mean that fashion studies could actually open up the discourse of fashion, which I think if you do, I mean, if you read the newspaper, it's a fairly limited section, but that will contribute to a more, broad discussion in the academic field.
Yes, I think the establishment of the Center for Fashion Studies was very important. It's very interesting to see how it came about too, because it was one of the biggest fashion brands in the world, H&M, who donated money to start this research center on fashion studies, which was the first in the world, the first academic place for fashion studies in the world.
In Stockholm, really?
Yes. So it's a huge thing actually, and I think it's a sign that the fashion industry wants to engage more into research, identify with research, and which in its turn means ethical engagement, because critical approach to your own production is a kind of opening up to ethical discussion. And so that's definitely a sign for a new development. And also fashion studies has been rising in different ways all over the world since then.
You were established in which year? In which year did you begin?
Around 2006. And today it's not sponsored by H&M anymore, but it's a regular university department. But for example, the Center for Fashion Study has generated around 8-10 PhD students who are now PhDs working at different places in the world. One in Paris, in London, in Chicago, there are more and more PhDs in fashion studies, even from other institutions around the world. And this is a kind of young generation of fashion scholars who have a very critical approach to fashion, in a positive way somehow, if you want to use that word. They embrace fashion. Because fashion, that's another interesting issue. Fashion has always been treated in a bit degrading way by science or by the academic field, like something too superficial and also femininely connoted, that is not worth the effort in a way. So this is also a big achievement of, for example, Center for Fashion Studies, bringing fashion studies to a respected level in the academy. And this is, it's very important, as we can see, and many students, there are enormous amounts of students who want to study fashion studies. And I am now back at the art history department, but while I was working at the Center for Fashion Studies, it was fantastic to see the engagement with the students. So many very engaged and critically engaged students, both kind of embracing fashion as a material and visual and aesthetic phenomenon and creative force in a way, but also looking at it critically from many, many different perspectives. So this is also a kind of flame or fuel that made the urgency of the topic we wanted to communicate. Are we?
Nu stopp.
Stopp.
Det var bra. Jag ville hitta en bra slutmening där. Ja, men det slutar bra.